Greetings from the Gilder Lehrman Center. I want to welcome everybody to today's GLC at Lunch program, Slavery in and Out of the Archives, History, Family, and Creative Inspiration in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Michelle Zaks, the GLC Associate Director, and typically I'm behind the scenes. Some of you might recognize my name from posting announcements in the chat. David Blight, GLC Director, is normally here introducing the program and moderating, but he got called away on History Department business. So it's my honor to be here in his place and to welcome our virtual audience and introduce today's speaker, GLC friend and colleague, Adrienne Joy Burns. And she will be introducing our speakers, the rest of the speakers today. But before I turn things over to Joy, I want to thank Mike Lotstein, who is the Yale University archivist, as well as another close colleague of the GLC and member of the Yale and Slavery Working Group. So it was Mike who really highlighted the important work that the Fairfield Slavery Project is doing. And we want to thank him for suggesting that we provide this opportunity today for them to share their work. And I also wanted to just say, as somebody who was born and raised in Connecticut, how much I just personally, as well as professionally, deeply appreciate the work of this project and other similar endeavors in this state. When I grew up several decades ago and attended public schools in Hamden, we certainly learned, a little bit about the triangular trade and about abolition. But really nothing or next to nothing about the existence of slavery and the length of the existence of slavery here in Connecticut. Didn't learn anything about the lives of enslaved people, the resistance of enslaved people, or the deep involvement of Connecticut and New England in the slave trade and the slave-based economy. So I just think that as we struggle to really come to terms with the legacies of slavery and racism and white supremacy that are still so present, as we struggle to come to terms with that, we really have to research this history, understand it properly, and acknowledge it if we're going to have any hope to be able to heal from the deep wounds that these histories have left. So that's just a big round of applause from this Connecticut Yankee to the folks that we'll be hearing from today. So now I want to turn things over to Joy. Just a quick introduction. Adrienne Joy Burns is a dear friend and colleague of the Gilder Lehrman Center. She's a very important member of the Yale and Slavery Working Group and has done a lot of research for that project, as well as her own research on slavery and her own family. Joy was born in Harlem and raised in the Bronx. She is a grandchild of the Great Migration. Her grandparents arrived at Ellis Island from Barbados and Antigua. That's on her maternal side. On her paternal side, her grandparents migrated from South Carolina and North Carolina in the 1920s. Joy was educated at Bronx Science, I guess that's high school, Bryn Mawr College, the City College of New York, and Emory. And for over 25 years, she's been researching her family's genealogy in archives in Savannah, at the Schomburg Collection in Harlem. And I think she's also traveled at least to Barbados, and I'm sure a lot of other sites. She's been doing this kind of work in New Haven since 2018. She started wondering, where did enslaved people and free Black people live in New Haven, starting from 1650 through 1850. So that led her to work on the lives of enslaved people at the Pardee Morris House in Morris Cove, New Haven, which is part of the New Haven Museum. And so she's been collaborating with that work with Dennis Culleton of the Great Witness Stones Project, as well as working with the New Haven Museum and groups of New Haven teachers. She's also a member of the Amistad Committee. I think she's on the board, in fact. And as I mentioned before, she's a member of the Yale and Slavery Working Group. And in her other, for her day job, Joy is a physician assistant at Yale's Smilow Cancer Center. So that's being said, take it away, Joy, and thank you very much.
Such a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to introduce Alec Lurie, Diane Ciccone, and Kyle Bass. Alec is going to speak first. He is the database manager at the Fairfield Slavery Project and curatorial assistant at the Fairfield Museum and History Center. He is a student of Dr. Vincent Rosevach, and who started this whole project and inspired Alec and another student, Olivia, to take it on and to bring it home and to teach more people about it. So here we go. We'll take it away, Alec.
Thank you. So I am going to share my screen. So as Joy said, this research is very much, it's a long-running research project. Vincent Rosevach was a professor of classical studies at Fairfield University, and he became frustrated with the fact that no one seemed to be studying local history in the town of Fairfield. So he decided, just on his own, he was going to fund it himself, and he was going to study slavery. And he set about sort of achieving three separate goals: put a completely undocumented aspect of Fairfield's history in writing, because it had not been in any of the published history books prior to that, as well as create a resource for descendants of enslaved people in Fairfield to actually access their genealogy, because until that point, there really wasn't any avenue for research for Northern slavery. And then lastly, he wanted to fully explore Fairfield's involvement in the slave trade from 1639, town's founding, all the way until 1848, when Connecticut finally abolished slavery. He passed away in 2018, but my research partner and I decided that we had to continue his work. We couldn't leave it unfinished. And so we turned it into a database, a genealogical database, that connects these family trees and explores the lives of individual enslaved people. That database is currently dormant, but is in the process of transferring over to the Fairfield Museum's custody. So a quick idea of what Fairfield is. Fairfield today is not what Fairfield looked like then. The Fairfield of today is significantly smaller. And for this reason, Fairfield's history of slavery has to be considered in a different way. For the most part, we look at slavery in Fairfield from its historic boundaries. So all the way up through Reading, Connecticut, down to the shore to Long Island Sound, from the Saugatuck River on the west side and the Pequannock River on the east side. And all of this land we consider Fairfield because honestly, overnight, an enslaved person could find themselves living in a new town as each one split off and incorporated. So additionally, I'd like to give you just a sort of a sense of what this timeline of slavery in Connecticut looks like. So Connecticut was founded in 1635, and basically as soon as the colony was founded, enslaved people started flooding into the colony. 1638 was really the turning point though. 1638, the Pequot War ended. The Pequot War was the first major conflict between European settlers and native peoples in this region. And all of the non-combatants in the town of Fairfield were essentially enslaved and sold to the West Indies. This allowed British traders to then purchase the enslaved people who were already being enslaved in the West Indies, which happened to be African captives. This began a series of transactions between New England native slaves and Caribbean African slaves. This is how the slave trade really got started. It was exacerbated by the fact that King Philip's War in 1678 allowed for Europeans to do it basically exactly the same thing. So from 1678 until 1774, it's just a sheer upwards trajectory of the level of enslaved people living in Connecticut. 1774, Connecticut decides they have to do something about this because it is, quote, injurious to the poor. So they ban the importation of slaves to the colony of Connecticut. They don't ban the sale, they don't ban the keeping of enslaved people, but they no longer accept importing new enslaved people. In 1779, 2 enslaved men from the town of Fairfield actually petitioned for the end of slavery. And they say in a very passionate rebuke, "We are convinced of our right by the laws of nature and by the whole tenor of the Christian religion, so far as we have been taught to be free, we have endeavored rightly to understand what is our right and what is our duty, and can never be convinced that we were made to be slaves." Their petition was unanimously rejected. Very shortly after, the British military, seeing an opportunity to disadvantage American troops, decided they were going to offer freedom to any defecting enslaved people from patriot slaveholders. This caused a wave of runaways from American slaveholders and sort of got the conversation starting about maybe we should do something about this issue of slavery in the colonies. 1784 rolls around and the gradual emancipation law is put into effect. It was very cleverly crafted to dull the financial impact on slaveholders. No one was immediately freed by the Gradual Emancipation Act. Enslaved males had to wait until the age of 25, and enslaved females had to wait until the age of 21. This also only applied to those born after 1784. So slavery would not see any real impact until the 1790s, 1800s. 1818, people of color specifically barred from voting. So even while there's some abolitionist sentiment going on, this does not negate the fact that there is serious racism and discrimination in the community. 1848, Connecticut finally abolishes slavery entirely. This is only 13 years before the start of the Civil War. In theory, you would have Black soldiers from Connecticut fighting in the Civil War, fighting the Confederacy, who could have been enslaved here in Connecticut. They would have known this experience firsthand. So a brief overview of what slavery looked like in the town of Fairfield. Treatment of enslaved people was highly variable, depended on the personalities of all of those involved. So while some were particularly cruelly treated, others experienced a strange generosity that is kind of hard to wrap your head around. So above, you can see that one enslaved woman, Dinah, was given the entirety of the estate of her slaveholder. Whereas on the bottom, we have a 14-year-old boy who was whipped and sold to the West Indies. Now, this was also another factor that was highly present in Fairfield's slave population. Family and separation were key to this entire process. Many enslaved people tried to unite their families, but were ultimately thwarted by the will of slaveholders. In some cases, like the young man that you see below, he was shipped away from his family thousands of miles to the Caribbean. Dinah, however, was given property in conjunction with property given to her children and grandchildren. They were able to create a whole estate and essentially keep their property in the family for generations to come. Enslaved labor was typically just a reflection of white labor. So the tasks that were being performed were additional labor So domestic tasks and farm labor tasks made up the majority of the work performed. So women would rear the children of the slaveholders, whereas men would be working on farms or attending to animals. Now, additionally, enslaved people did marry. This is a misconception that's been passed around. Enslaved people didn't marry. They absolutely did. But their marriages were often strained by the fact that they were separated between households. And this is something that's particularly important when considering the story of Tim and Lil, Diane and Kyle's ancestors. So I also want to explain, I always try and conceptualize my genealogy as backwards genealogy. Whereas a descendant will go from their self to their parents, to their parents' parents, I do it backwards. I go from an enslaved ancestor to the enslaved ancestor's children, their children, and so on and so on. And so the meeting of Diane, Kyle, and I is the meeting of these two arrows coming together. And it's really quite fascinating to see the different ways in which we have approached these stories. They have oral storytelling, and I just have plain documents. So I also want to mention that there are key moments in an enslaved person's life that are typically the ones that produce the best records. Now, red lines on this graph are property records, whereas blue lines are vital records, births, marriages, deaths. These are found in different places, but they give you a different sense of what an enslaved person was going through. Put together, though, this can give you a fairly comprehensive idea of an enslaved person's life. And this has really been the crux of what the Slavery Project has been about. Compiling all these records into a single narrative so that we can then present this to the descendants of enslaved people. I use probate records as home base. Now, probate records are wills, inventories, and estate documents. So enslaved people as property were typically listed as itemized property within an enslaver's estate. Now, from this, you can get a lot of information. You can figure out whether or not they were distributed to heirs, or whether they were sickly or elderly, male, female, etc. What's really fascinating about these documents is that they don't only show where enslaved people were going as property, but the expenses, the debts and credits of an estate can also give you clues as to what free Black people in the community were doing. So oftentimes I'll find instances where enslaved people and even free people in a community were digging graves for the recently deceased, or even tolling bells at the deceased funeral. It can give you a sense of the labor that was taking place. And as you can see here in an estate debt and credit, you have a payment to a man named David Allen for schooling an enslaved boy named Tony. Church records are also quite essential. Church records are really the kinds of records that give you a sense of the genealogy, the family connections that an enslaved person has. So I basically break them up into two separate categories. You have the religious rites, which are baptismal and marriage records. And then you have the health of the congregation, death records and birth records, which a minister would keep tabs on. They needed to know how many congregants they actually had. So below, you can see that a child of Ned and Maria Judson, people of color, died on September, unknown date. And that this was just sort of the record. This is the one line that acknowledges this person's existence. It doesn't seem like a lot, but you can actually get a lot of information out of this. For one, we know that Ned and Maria are married. We know this because otherwise the church wouldn't have acknowledged that they had had a child. Ned and Maria also are using the name of a previous enslaver. Judson is a white family name in the town of Fairfield. So it's likely that they were previously enslaved. Now, the child doesn't have a name attributed here. That probably means that this child was born and died in such a short time that they were not able to be baptized or even properly named. So this was probably an infant death. All of this you can get from a single line of text that ultimately doesn't really tell you much on its face. I don't really use census records as much as people would expect, because the censuses of the early 1800s and late 1700s are very, very vague in the way they describe enslaved and free Black people. So here you can see three separate free Black people in the town of Fairfield: Christopher Negro, Quam, and Peter Nash. Now, all of their family is itemized as a single number, the number of people in their household. We don't know if this includes themselves. We don't know how many males, how many females, what the age ranges are. We know nothing except the number of people. Additionally confusing about this is that while they're all free and they were all recently enslaved, they chose different ways of giving themselves a surname. So Christopher, he chose the name Negro, a simple description of his race. Peter Nash, on the other hand, adopted his enslaver's surname. Quam doesn't have a surname at all. This is quite confusing when you're moving into the present, in which basically everyone has a surname. I also run into an issue here with unclear legal statuses, because slavery died out in such an unusual fashion in Connecticut. It wasn't just a quick one and done kind of thing, that there are some idiosyncrasies that just simply can't be addressed by the census. One of them is that enslaved people sometimes would have to purchase their relatives. So Christopher, at the bottom of this page, should theoretically be considered a slaveholder. In 1799, he purchased 2 infants. They were both his children. And he had to do this because they were unable to be freed under Connecticut state law. They would become technically a burden to the community, and so they would have to remain enslaved until the age of 21 and 25, respectively. Additionally, we have Edwin Bulkley on top. Edwin was born free. He's the first generation of freed people in his family. Yet he was in a contract that essentially prevented him from receiving payment for any of the work he provided for a man named David Judson. This extended to work that was previously done and work that would occur in the future, as you can see from this excerpt from David Judson's will. He eventually was given property, but only after David Judson and his widow had passed away. So with that, I want to leave you with Tim and Lil. This is how I met Tim and Lil. Tim as a Negro child servant to William Bennett, being baptized in 1766, and Lil as a Negro girl valued at 20 pounds in the inventory of Joseph Disbrow. So with that, I want to pass it on to Diane Ciccone, and she is going to tell you a bit about her ancestors.
Thank you, Alex. First of all, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be able to talk about my journey of my enslaved ancestors that lived in Fairfield between the mid 1700s till 1799, when they were manumitted and moved to Delhi as a free Black family. People always ask me, when did I start? I actually started in 1998, and it was a different ancestor that I was trying to find information on. And through that, this picture, thank you, Alec, is the house that still stands where Tim and Lil were last enslaved, and I'll talk about it a little later. So, doing my research over my ancestor, who was a enslaved man out of Virginia, and at the time of the Civil War, he walked to freedom and mustered into the 26 USTC colored troops out of New York State. And so, at the end of his life, he was living in Delhi, New York. And I went to Delhi to do some digging in records. And those of you who have done genealogy, you know, you kind of go down the rabbit hole and you keep digging, you keep digging, you keep digging. So I had been talking to the town clerk in Delhi, and I needed another document. And I asked my mother, can you go and pick up this document? Well, she went to the village clerk, and the village clerk had been researching the local Black families in Delhi for over 100 years. And she mentioned Tim and Lil as being enslaved in Connecticut in 1799. And can you go to, Alec, go to the slide there's a timeline. So I put together a timeline so you can see that my earliest finding of Tim is in 1766. So in talking with the local historian in Delhi, they told me about a time. The local folklore was that one of the Bennett descendants had come into the newspaper and came with an old, tattered, and folded piece of paper and said, "These are my family's freedom records." And so the historians and the people in the town, they looked at it. They didn't really believe it. Can you show the next? And that's Tolliver, who I was looking for. And can you show the next slide, please? And so the paper is what the Bennetts, Tim and Lil, came from Connecticut with. And then show the next slide. And why people weren't really sure if it was valid is because in the records in the clerk's office, you get the application. So if you see the application, you see it's David Judah. And if you go back to the previous slide, you see that it's again by David Judah. So I was then able to confirm that what the Bennetts carried from Connecticut was the proof that they were fact-free, and what most people would see in records is the application. So that gave me a starting point to go back to Connecticut. And that's where it's a whole different way of looking at things, because now I'm looking at and trying to find enslaved relatives. So I was looking now in land records and wills and inventories, and the reality of sinking in that my ancestors were considered pieces of property and they would be valued. And so one of the first documents I came across, and Alec has shown it, is the inventory of Joseph Disbrow, who had enslaved my ancestor Lil. And she's got a value assessed to her, and she's sandwiched between the value of livestock. And when I read that, it's like it makes you stop, because this is your DNA, and they're not any different than the chair that's being valued, the table that's being valued, or the livestock that's being valued. The one nice thing that I found about Connecticut is that the church records would keep birth, baptism, marriage, and death records. And they kept them from back in the 1600s. And they also include enslaved people. So I was able to find the marriage records of Tim and Lil in 1791. I found the birth of their first daughter, Nancy. I found the birth of their second son, who I'm descended from, William Ward, and then all of their children. And we also found the will in which Tim is, and Kyle is going to show that later, the will in which Tim is referenced, that William Bennett said, "I give my man Jack and my boy Tim to my wife as long as she remains my widow." But then, so I know they married, Tim and Lil are married in 1791, and it was commonplace for them to be in different households. So Lil was in one household and Tim was in another household. And the question became, and they had children, they were different households, but when they were manumitted out of the same household. And it was something that I couldn't figure out. It was like that missing piece. How did Lil and William and her children get to the household of the Bennett? And I'd been communicating back in the late 90s. What happens is you're writing letters to people. And I kept writing to the Fairfield Historical Society, said, I just don't know what happened, how it happened. So I went to Fairfield, And they gave me some documents because I'm into verifying everything that I found. And the last document was folded and the woman walked away. And I opened it up and it was the bill of sale of, it's still, I mean, 20 some odd years later, and it still chokes me up. It's the bill of sale of Lil and her son, William Ward, to Joseph Bennett. And for then it became real. It's one thing you theorize if you are African descended person and your family's been here 100, 150 years, you know someone in your family was enslaved. But to actually see a document and touch a document that your DNA that comes from you was bought and sold is a very sobering moment. So I collected all the documents. I mean, I have birth records and baptism records, and of course the bill of sale, the manumission papers. And what I did is at the end, I said, you know, this is something that I need to share with the family. So I put together a book, Journeys of Freedom. And I had done research on 4 families because I wanted my family to know where we came from and to be prideful of and be knowing that our ancestors were resilient in a time of the country when they were considered property. And then fast forward to 2019, Kyle calls me up and says, hey, I just found out that the Westport Museum of History and Culture has an exhibition of the enslaved people in Westport. And they've invited us to come and talk because we are descendants. And that was such a liberating event because it showed me that there are people that understood the involvement that the enslaved community had and their contributions to Westport. And so we went there, and then I sort of put it away. And then this winter, I'm talking to Kyle, and Kyle's the dramatist. He's done some wonderful work. And I said, you know, I have all this material. I should do something with it. I should do something more than just share it with the family. And so we talked about it. And so I dusted off my research. I got in touch with Alex. I got in touch with Ramin at the executive director at Westport, and started again to do the digging. And through that digging, we learned of a Bennett descendant who knew the owner of the house where my ancestors were last enslaved. And I was able to go to that house and to walk in the rooms, many of them still looking the same way as when Tim and Lil would have been there. And Ramin, who was kind of like my house whisperer, would tell me what Lil probably did in each of the rooms that we were in. But it wasn't until we climbed those back stairs up to what had formerly been the attic, and I started telling the story, that I just broke down in tears, because it's the enormity of it's one thing to see these documents, but to know that it's personal, is that we come from enslaved people. So I've been sort of toying around, what am I going to do? Is it going to be a memoir? And I wrote a couple chapters on, you know, what it was like for me to take this journey. And then, but something kept bringing me back to, and Alec mentioned it, the gradual abolition law of 1784. And as we heard, that if you were born after March 1st, 1784, if you're a girl, 21 years, and if you're a guy, 25 years, you'd be free. Well, Tim and Lil were having children. And I wonder what it must have been like for Lil to raise a family and give birth to children, knowing that they could be sold away, they could be given away, and she would never see them again. And at the same time, that she would be enslaved for life. And I grew up in a time in this country where I have complete control of my body. I had complete control of whether any child that I was born in me, what I could do with that child, I could raise the child. And so it then hit me that's the story. It's the story of Lil and what she would have gone through. And I want to just end by the quote of Toni Morrison, who says, essentially says, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so that's the story that I want to tell. I want to tell the story of Lil and what it's like as a woman, an enslaved woman, raising children in a time when she had no control over them. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Michelle, for this invitation, everyone at GLC, Daniel. Thank you, Alec, for your important work at the Fairfield Museum of History. And thank you, Ramin Ganeshram and her staff and the board at the Westport Museum for History and Culture for their work, including the conservation of our ancestors' names. And I also want to thank the Upstate Institute at Colgate University for their support of my research, traditional and creative. And especially thank you to you, Diane, for your original and ongoing research into the history of our family in slavery and in freedom. And I think it's fitting and right that I should follow Diane in this presentation, because her research into our family history, as she's discussed, on enslavement in the South and in pre and post-revolutionary New England, gave me evidence and knowledge beyond lore. The purse strings of the debt in which the past holds us all are tied in a knot to the history of slavery. But for me and for Diane, as she's shown and shared, it's more than history, and it is in no way abstract. It's personal and emotion bringing, and the source of creative inspiration. That I can say as fact, my ancestors were enslaved and can speak their names stirs me deeply. That I can write their names and their stories into my creative work sustains me unceasingly. This is a image of Tolliver. We're looking here, and before Diane's original research installed Tim and Lil in my imagination, from family stories I knew about our great-great-grandfather Tolliver, who at the outbreak of the Civil War escaped his enslavement, broke free from his forced and vile servitude, intended for life, and meant to descend to his offspring and theirs. And I knew, excuse me, and I knew that Tolliver had joined the Civil War fight as mustering, as Diane said, into the 26th Regiment of Colored Troops in New York. And I knew Tolliver's parents' names, Martha and Alexander. And that feels like very remarkable, like a remarkable kind of gift, because it is. In the next slide, I first brought my great-great-grandfather Tolliver into my creative work in my play Possessing Harriet, set in 1839. In Possessing Harriet, I inventively dramatized the true story of Harriet Powell, a young biracial enslaved woman who escaped to Canada, and her meeting with some folks whose names you might know: Elizabeth Cady, not yet Stanton in my play, and abolitionist Gerrit Smith. You see them sitting there left and right, played by Lucy Lavely and Wynn Harmon, with Harriet in the middle, played by Nicole King, and Tom Leonard, who I'm talking about in a moment, played by Daniel Morgan Shelley, standing there. But of all the people, so in the play, as I said, we meet Elizabeth Cady, as well as Harriet, Elizabeth Cady, and abolitionist Gerrit Smith, and names you don't probably know: Thomas Leonard, a Black man living free in Syracuse, New York. All real people, as I said. Of them all, the archive has the least to say and reveal about Thomas Leonard, an operative of the nascent Underground Railroad, remember this is 1839, system of Central New York. Here, I took dramatic license and I imbued Thomas, who, and this is spoiler alert, may have been a fugitive slave, with pieces of fact from Tolliver, my great-great-grandfather's life. So for instance, we know that Tolliver our great-great-grandfather escaped slavery in Virginia from Walkerton. And I overlaid a piece of that onto Thomas and sort of the fictive creation that he becomes in my play. I don't hold myself to rendering sort of photographic depictions of folks in my plays, even if they were real. For me, it's really about sort of a weirded freehand drawing rendering of real people to become characters in plays. That's my aim and goal. And here I'm giving you a glimpse of one of the ways in which I work with research. As much as a source of data, for me as a playwright, the archive becomes a source of media, a mine from which I extract the raw material of fact to use for my ultimately fictive creative expression, my playwriting. Tolliver also had a silent and, for me, profoundly meaningful presence in the play's world premiere production. You see him here, a picture of him in a drawer. I placed his image in the drawer of the tea table that was part of the set, made it a reliquary of it for him. First, through Diane's research and then my own in Fairfield and Westport, I came to know the names and some of the circumstances of our ancestors, Tim and Lil, and their children, enslaved in Westport before and after the Revolutionary War. And I've set for myself the project of writing a dramatic work, a play, perhaps a screenplay, based on their lives in bondage in Fairfield. In 2019, in preparation for a research trip to Westport and Fairfield, I made a call to the Westport Museum for History and Culture to make an appointment to visit the archives there. When I told them I was interested in what they had on Tim and Lil Bennett, and that I was a descendant, someone might have gasped and said the names of Tim and Lil and their children, Almon and Almine, were going to be ensconced in pavement stones as part of their exhibit, remembered to be History of African Americans in Westport. It's serendipity, yes, but I like to think that our ancestors want us to remember, have a hand in the things we do that keep their names alive. So here you're looking, if you were to visit my home on the mantle, you'd see this framed and large photograph of a centuries yellow document dated August 5th, 1772, a will, and this is the will that Diane alluded to. And a closer look in the next slide, written in and executed in an antique cursive hand, too elegant for what it conveys: ownership of human property. The Negro boy in line 14 named Tim to his wife, to the wife of his master, William Bennett of Fairfield, so long as she, as Diane said, shall remain his widow. It's a documentation of our family in this country before it was a country. That's very meaningful to me, which is why it's in my home as a reminder. And to know that the boy Tim referenced in this document is my 7 times great-grandfather on my mother's matrilineal bloodline is beyond meaningful. In the next slide, this is the house that Diane referenced. I suppose I'm animated, the house that Tim and Lil would have been enslaved in. I'm animated, I suppose, by the desire to imagine and write my enslaved ancestors, not in the expected agrarian setting of the Southern plantation, but in the setting here like this in New England, pre and post-Revolutionary War domesticity. My ancestors surrounded by the comforts of their master's relative wealth. So in 2019, Diane and I stood outside this historic Bennett House, and as is my compulsion, I couldn't but imagine it as a set for a play. And then this past summer, as Diane mentioned, she toured the inside of the house. I was not able to make that trip, but Diane FaceTimed me in on the tour, and I asked if the doorknobs were original to the house. I wanted there to be something Tim or Lil or the children had touched. No, not the doorknobs, but up that narrow set of stairs that Diane referenced to the third floor attic stood a rough-hewn beam post original to the house. Through the FaceTime, I saw Diane touch it. I saw her hand on it, and it was Lil's hand, and it was Tim's hand, and their children's. And I began to imagine a drama unfolding in that room, a great reckoning in all those small rooms, to borrow from Bert Stades. One of the, in my own trip and research that I've done in the archives in Fairfield, the name David Judah did come up. And I became very fascinated when I discovered that David Judah, who's a signatory on both the application and the manumission papers for Tim and Lil, that he was married to a Bennett. And I wondered about that. And that he was perhaps from the first family of Jewish folks living in Fairfield. And I wondered about that. And I wondered about the historic idea of the Jews as the enslaved people, and that he was somehow connected to the emancipation of Tim and Lil. Drama and ideas began to spool out of my mind and continue to, as I think about Tim and Lil as subjects in a play, but not just Tim and Lil, but the Bennetts, because there can be no slaves without masters. And so I'm always interested in bringing as full a picture as I suppose my dramatic idea will allow to tell the stories I tell. And I'm very interested, as Diane had mentioned, about the Gradual Abolition Act and the context under which Tim and Lil were living and thinking about that and wanting and desiring their emancipation. And in the play that I'm imagining, it is in fact Lil who sort of is the driving force beyond for them to seek their freedom. I haven't quite figured out all the drama, but that they were in a revolutionary household and post, that they were in the household of what had been a British sympathizer. I wondered dramatically what's possible. Again, my work begins in history, but it becomes a kind of fiction to get at something beyond fact. Dramatic truth, I guess, is always my project. So standing outside the home and looking at it, I began to think about who were the people, and it is looking at the documents, the smaller detail, not someone say smaller, specific details that become for me really, really very useful. As I said, that media that I mine from the archive, which becomes the materials with which I work to create a fiction. We were looking at the pavement stones. If we can see them again, I am deeply connected to and made strong by my family's history of enslavement, endurance, resistance, self-emancipation, survival, and flourishment. It is a tremendous and unceasing source of pride and fortitude in my life. What else is there to make of it that's useful? I have to, I've asked myself that question, and for me, it's about rendering these stories in dramatic terms. Yes, our enslavement past holds stunning, appalling pain, centuries of it, but I must claim the broken chains of my family's enslavement past and rattle them in defiant joy and celebration. And yes, I suppose as a warning. I get asked a lot about why I write about slavery, most from people who don't know that I am connected very much to my family's history, but I do. I write about slavery, not all my work, but I write about it quite a lot, directly or indirectly, because it is the genesis story of my family in this country. Since before this country was a country, we've been here on its soil. My family story isn't an African-American story, it's an American story, the American story, if we're honest and brave. So I return to the archives. I keep returning to the archives. I keep digging to fashion a creative work from what I encounter in my family history. I wipe my eyes of dust and tears, but I keep digging. And then I try to find a place in my work for what I'm digging, for what I'm digging reveals about all of us and what I'm discovering there. And for that story and all the stories I've written and hopefully will write, I am indebted to Tolliver, my great-great-grandfather, who made himself free, and to Lil and Tim, who endured until free, for the inspiration of their lives, their courage, and their strength. Strength I inherit by writing their names into my creative work. And finally, I want to say again that Diane, your original work as a historian in the archive has inspired and led me to my creative work as a playwright in the archive. And now we're conspirators, breathing the same air, if you will, of our family's history of bondage in Fairfield, even as we work down different creative paths to explore and make more public our shared family history. Thank you.
Well, Kyle, one of the questions that I wanted to pose first, it's actually the last question that popped up in the Q&A is your script of your play, Possessing Harriet, available?
It is. You can order it on Amazon. Standing Stone Books is the publisher. You can order it there. So yes, it's available.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Alex, so I wanted to bring it a bit more local to New Haven and Yale and ask you to speak a little bit about Silliman and Dwight, Timothy Dwight and Benjamin Silliman, because they lived in Westport, Fairfield area and had enslaved people.
Yeah, so Benjamin Silliman and Timothy Dwight, who both have colleges named after them at Yale University, were in fact slaveholders here in the town of Fairfield. Benjamin was a particularly prolific slaveholder. He had at least 11 enslaved people, such that he needed actually a separate building to house them all. And the image that you see at the very beginning of this session is actually the image of the slave quarters on his property. Benjamin was notorious in a way for his treatment of his enslaved people, as he actually signed his slaves into leasing contracts that superseded their legal right to emancipation at the age of 25 and 21, respectively. And yes, so Timothy Dwight, a little bit less is known about his individual slaveholding beliefs and general actions, but he also did write a poem called Greenfield Hill, in which he talks a little bit about how slavery is not so bad for people on his plantation and how people have it much, much worse in the South and in the Caribbean, and that all of his enslaved people are quite happy to be enslaved. Obviously, it's Timothy Dwight trying to wrap his head around his own guilt in this issue.
Thank you. There was a question, it was kind of a legal question. I don't know, Diane, if you've had any adventures into the legal aspects of enslavement, particularly, at least in Connecticut. And it's from James Ciccone. Was there a codified legal process in Connecticut for an enslaved person to petition for manumission? How did it work? Who had jurisdiction to grant such a petition? Who had standing to file? What criteria applied? Was the criteria arbitrary? Where did the authorities, presumably county officials, presume to derive the power to exercise jurisdiction? Was there a provision in the state constitution, the county charter? Please explain.
Okay.
That's pretty.
It's a pretty intense question. So this is
Right.
this is what I do know, is that there's always was concern because early on enslavers would set their elderly enslaved people free, and they would become a public charge. So then it morphed into that you had to make an application as the enslaver. The enslaved had to be over the age of 25 and less than 45 and were capable of being able to take care of themselves. And they had to be desirous of their emancipation. And that's really what happened after 1784, 1792. And that was, I mean, that's the law, and that was the culture. I don't know if Alex, you have anything more you want to add to that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And so that specific law was addressing the fact that many people who were born before 1784 theoretically would not be legally emancipated unless they were actually applying for it. So the 25 to 45 age range was specifically for enslaved people born before 1784. And when they would apply to the justices of the peace. So it seems as though this was sort of an appointed position within the town of Fairfield. Fairfield was the county seat of Fairfield County. So luckily for the people who are living in this town, they had very, very close contact with county officials. But otherwise, it's a little bit more amorphous, and it would really depend upon who was playing the game.
You know, and I want to add that, you know, when Alex talks about the documents and what it tells you, the manumission application of Tim and Lil also kind of give us an idea of their age range, because we knew they had to be older than 25 and younger than 45. We see them in 1768. We see them in 1766. So we kind of have an idea. We do not know exactly their age, but the manumission papers kind of help us sort of zone in on how old they might have been when they sought their freedom.
And I think one of the other things that was part of that legislation was if someone elderly was to be manumitted, then the householder had to pay a bond to the state, so that there would be money that the state could use to support this person, so that that person would not, at least in New Haven County that I'm aware of, end up in the almshouse, which was what frequently happened. So thanks. And then there was another question. Here we go. Are there, this was from Adam Aronson. Are there other towns actively recovering the history of enslavement in this way? Are you in touch? Have you met with historic houses or families descended from other enslaved in New England, New York, or Pennsylvania? I can answer part of that question. I'm a member of the research team for the Witness Stones Project, which is founded by Dennis Culloden in Guilford, Connecticut. And there are, if you go to their website, the witnessstones.org, you will find photographs, and there's a map of all the historic houses, churches, town halls, and I think there are a couple of cemeteries also that have witness stones in the ground marking the presence of enslaved people had either lived there or been buried there and lived in that town. Additionally, groups like the Connecticut Freedom Trail, which was sponsored by the Amistad Committee, also has a website with a map where you can look, and it has historic houses and there are markers. And most of these houses will tell you about the lives of the enslaved people who live there, or at least historical societies have kind of records of this. Alec, do you know about any others?
Yeah, I mean, there's a smattering of slavery projects across the state and really across the Northeast, but it's really in its nascent stages, because for the bulk of the 20th and 21st century at this point, the focus had really been on the South. And it's still quite a bit of a hurdle to get people to recognize that slavery was here in the North and that it was an important part of the economy, but also of daily life here in even the most provincial of Connecticut, New England towns. So there's a steep climb, but there are some projects being built up in other regions of the state.
Great, thanks. So Kyle, you had mentioned Thomas Leonard and the Underground Railroad. One of the fascinating things about the stories in the North about abolition is about how the stories of the white abolitionists are so profoundly centered. And so to hear a name like Thomas Leonard, I want to know, what city did he live in? Did he move around? How much do you know about him?
Well, yes, that was exactly sort of my goal in writing Possessing Harriet. I was commissioned to write it by the Onondaga Historical Association in Syracuse. And interestingly, they're not a theater, so I really didn't know what they could do for me in terms of developing the play. But I also, at that time, happened to be the associate artistic director at Syracuse Stage, where I am now the resident playwright. So I had resources, but I couldn't really find a way into the play. I couldn't find an emotional way into the play. I have to have that in order to write a play. I have to write it. And so with Thomas Leonard, who was very much part of this escape venture for Harriet Powell. Harriet Powell, as I said, was a biracial woman brought to Syracuse in 1839 by her enslaver from Mississippi. She was highly prized. She was 3/4 white and 1/4 Black. And she was exoticized and highly prized for her beauty. And so she is in a hotel in Syracuse where Thomas Leonard works as a waiter in 1839, living as a free man in Syracuse. He is part of sort of the network of both white and Black abolitionists in the very rich sort of site of abolition, which is upstate New York. And there isn't a lot known about him. He comes into the record really very late when the Civil War breaks out, or I should say when he dies, an obituary was written for him or about him by the town, the city, because they knew his role in the Harriet Powell escape. And he was by that point, they say, in his 70s when the war broke out, and he was one of the first to volunteer. And they were like, "No, Thomas, you're too old." But just knowing that about him, right, informed greatly how I wanted to center him in the play as the primary driving force in Harriet eventually, wanting freedom and making the hard choice for it. Yes, he lived in Syracuse. In my research, in the obituary, it had sort of a rumor that he may have been a fugitive slave. And I was like, oh, thank you, I need that. And so that, in fact, became a late dramatic reveal in my play. But he was friends with Gerrit Smith. They did work together in abolition, and he did what Harriet Powell did get away. She did get to Canada, but her enslaver John Davenport pursued her. He was very instrumental in the second and getting past the second Fugitive Slave Act that was much more punitive, much more harsh, much more in favor of the slaveholder. And Thomas did go to Canada after her to tell her that Davenport was still after her. So we really don't know where he came from, but he lived and worked in Syracuse as a free man, and there he died.
So Adrienne Van Dyke had said, oops, I just lost it. Kyle, she said your words were so poignant that she was wiping tears from her face. Which is really quite wonderful. So Alec, when we think about enslaved people in Connecticut, and generally in the United States overall, we don't generally think of Indian slavery. And Indian slavery played such a fundamental role in how Black people came to be enslaved in this country. So Adrian Van Dyke had earlier also asked a question. Okay, we've got 8 minutes, so this is going to have to be quick. Adrian Van Dyke had also asked a question about a statue of Major John Mason that's in Mystic, and they want to. There's a group that wants to take it down. He was the commander of the forces during the Pequot War. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, you know, of all the people, it's kind of interesting that John Mason is the one who's being memorialized with a statue. He sort of headed up the quote unquote Mystic Massacre, in which hundreds of men, women, and children were murdered and burned alive in the Mystic Fort. And yes, this has direct ties to slavery. Maybe not as direct as some of the Confederate statues in the South, for instance, but yes, this history is all tied together. And oftentimes you'll see enslaved people marrying free Native Americans, enslaved Native Americans marrying free Black people. And these communities intermesh to such a degree that it actually became a legal problem for the Paugussett Golden Hill Nation as they tried to achieve federal recognition, because they raised their hands and said, we're Native American and we deserve recognition. And on the other hand, another group was saying, actually, this is a free Black community. And those two conflicts became an issue and actually wound up tanking their application, unfortunately. But the story is highly integrated in that way. And again, of all the people, John Mason is one person that I definitely wouldn't make a statue of. Whether it's taken down is up to everyone else who's involved, but that's my thought.
Thank you.
I'm going to chime in on that, if I may, really quickly, is that I wonder about what would happen in this country that instead of taking down statues, we revise the plaques.
Totally. Actually, what I would like to see is like to see the statues taken off their pedestal, put at the same level of us, no longer elevated, and then revise the plaque, so that we see this person as being like us, human, fallible, capable of horrific things, and much more relatable, instead of they're godlike. They're on the same level. They're just like you and me, capable of messing up big time. But thank you so much. I'm going to kick it back to Michelle because I know she has some announcements and things to make. And thank you everyone for coming today. Wonderful panelists, Kyle, Alec, and Diane. Can't wait to meet you all in person. We got to figure out how to get together at the GLC.
Yes.
Thank you, Joy.
Well, I don't have much more to add except my great thanks. This was so beautiful and powerful and moving. Really, really appreciate the blending of just the straight up archival research and such a great explication, Alec, of the general context of slavery in Connecticut. And then, bringing in the real lasting impact that this has, on your personal lives and on the emotional landscape that we all are living in. It's really, really beautifully done. And I hope we can continue this meeting of minds in some other format in the future. I did post some announcements in the chat. We just have one more public program coming up. If you sign up for our newsletter, you'll get all our announcements. We do have this ongoing professional development program for teachers called the Black and Latino History Project that's headed up by GLC Director of Education, Tom Thurston. And this is a series of working groups dealing with different topics related to Black and Latino history in the state. The first topic was shade tobacco, the shade tobacco industry. And I think there's a link in the chat for how you can register for the public program. Teachers and scholars have been working together to develop lesson plans and just curricular ideas for how to teach that topic in the classroom. So we invite you to join us for that. And then we'll have a bit of a holiday break when it comes to public programs, and we'll be back at it in January. So we wish you all the best over the holidays, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michelle.